Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to the Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 1 of season 1 of HBO's Westworld. Join me, will you? So, my very favorite television pilots, from Lost to Breaking Bad to Leftovers to Mad Men, are in a number of ways quite similar to my very favorite film ones in larger film franchises, from A New Hope to Back to the Future to The Fellowship of the Ring, just that they are kind of in this oxymoronical way, these satisfying enigmas. Yes, in one sense they are self-contained, while in another leaving me wanting more. And obviously on a television pilot, the former of those two is slightly less important, considering that usually you only have to wait a week to watch that story continue. Nonetheless, you still do have to wait, making our satisfaction in that piece of the narrative at least partially dependent upon how self-contained it really is. And along with that, you want that pilot episode to give you a really strong sense of the characters and ideas that show will be exploring, if only because, also unlike films, it's going to be asking you to invest a lot more time into it. And with that said, I did feel like this Westworld pilot was only ever partially a satisfying enigma, quite often disjointed and unfocused and never fully confident in one distinct or cohesive point of view. Nonetheless, there was still a lot to like about this pilot, so let's first go ahead and dive into a few of the positives that we saw in it. First off, I very much enjoyed the way that we were brought into the world of Westworld. Unlike the 1973 original, which brought us into the theme park with the human characters and encouraged us to see that place through their eyes, this show did quite the opposite, immediately taking us into an android's point of view and showing us just how much relatable hope, optimism, and light emanated from that artificial life. And that for the remainder of the pilot, we were never once shown a more innocent or positive character than the android Dolores, really did seem to indicate which side the writers wanted us to relate to more. And also working towards that same end was the fantastic reveal that James Marsden's Teddy was an android as well. Just on how he was presented as this upstanding, confident, and chivalrous individual whose quote-unquote humanity we identified with from the outset, only to be shown later that we were in fact identifying with a robot. And what made those synthetic lives all the more identifiable was that even though initially they seemed to be no more autonomous or capable of free will than that player piano that restarted day after day playing the same old melody, we very quickly saw that there were in fact variations to their existence. Variations that occurred apart from human interference and design, like the slight shifts in how Dolores awoke each morning. And to press further into the connection between that player piano and the androids, it was interesting to note that the thing that finally stopped that instrument altering its tune was blood, splattered across it in a similar way to the blood splattered across Dolores' face, which did seem to imply that the only way for the androids to break free and change their melody was through violence. And really our concern for these androids was only made to grow in the scene where bandit Hector Escaton rode into town and, along with his Charlize Theron lookalike, began killing people right and left. Because in that scene, not only did the tearful goodbye between Dolores and Teddy stand in stark contrast to the human guests' insistence upon that vulgar photo with Hector's corpse, but also the entire situation was in fact authored by this ridiculous Hollywood-type writer who actually found a way to write the Wild West equivalent of the Fast Five bank heist. Now, even as this pilot episode did primarily focus on getting us to identify with the android characters, some of the human characters were also made relatably broken. But really what made the humans that visited Westworld, as well as the engineers behind it, so very fascinating was just how similar they ended up being to the robots that populated that place. In very telling ways, the very behavior that they exemplified was being imitated by their robot children. So, for example, though the pilot only scratched the surface with the Anthony Hopkins Ford character, we've already seen that his frustration over mankind's inability to evolve has definitely made its way into his own creation. And with Bernard, we've certainly got a sense that the loss of his son was what pushed him down this road, bent on creating life that could never be lost, ever being resurrected and restarted day after day. Interestingly, in his pursuit to create life, he'd sort of lost touch with it, in a lot of ways kind of acting more like his machines than a man, like in how he was so instantly distracted by his colleagues' eyebrow movements. The humans around him were no longer souls to be connected with, just pounds of flesh to be studied and integrated in some way into his creations. Now, even as Jonathan Nolan, the writer and director of this first episode, never felt fully secure enough to really hold on them long enough for us to really enjoy them, he was still able to infuse a number of very striking images into this his creation. Like a man zipping himself back into a body bag, or an android drinking milk that would leak out of his bullet hole-ridden body, or modern equipment invading a western town. I love, too, the comparison that Nolan seemed to be drawing between the creation of film and the creation of the life that populated Westworld. The images of the artificial horse in the opening credits being very reminiscent to some of the very first zoetrope images of a galloping horse. And, of course, there was the very eerie recurring motif of flies landing on androids' faces, all of which remain unharmed until that very final shot, which did seem to be teeing up the idea that Dolores will become that steer, so to speak, that leads her herd of androids towards revolution. She being the oldest of all the androids and asked the question directly by one of her makers, I just couldn't help but think that, unlike her fellow androids, she had learned to lie and was actually holding a lot more in when she said things like, I see nothing. It would just be fantastic to discover that the character who seemed to be the most content and compliant was actually the most conniving and contentious, and that her programmed belief and fate would ultimately be her path to freedom. Even so, this still wasn't a perfect pilot, quite often showing the unfortunate signs of its production woes, which did involve a number of rewrites and reshoots. So even while the opening with Teddy and Dolores was quite effective, that portion of the narrative did feel disjointed from the rest of it, as it was all but dropped after those first 15 minutes, different characters with very different motivations and desires being focused on instead. Especially the Ed Harris gunslinger, even as that was a fun reversal from what we saw in the 1973 film, where the Man in Black character, in that instance played by Yul Brynner, was a Terminator-like android. All that Ed Harris really did during this pilot was run around setting up the larger mysteries that didn't necessarily complement the story that was being told in this hour and 10 minutes. Going forwards, I am very curious to find out what this critical failure was that occurred 30 years ago, and if the mentioning of that incident was actually setting up the reveal that none of the human creators were actually human at all, but in fact just some really advanced form of AI that continues to quote-unquote procreate by making more robots to populate their Westworld. In the end, the Westworld pilot was, in moments, a bit of a mess, but remained very intriguing nonetheless, and similar to Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica, seemed to tee up a series that could ask some really interesting questions and explore some very fascinating themes, like how these sins of the father are passed on to his children, or what does it really mean to be human. And ultimately, in looking at this artificial life and observing its flaws and brokenness, we are, in turn, kind of shown a reflection of our own flaws and our own brokenness. And that's definitely why I'm very excited to continue to break down week to week these Westworld episodes. I just feel like it's going to be ripe for this kind of analysis. I would love to know what you guys thought, though, of the pilot. Did it excite you? Are you intrigued? Are you hooked? Are you going to stay on board for this? What worked for you? What didn't? Definitely comment below and let me know. And finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.